So this year, America is celebrating its 250th anniversary. And the remarkable thing about being at Bevis Synagogue is that, of course, we were there, or we existed at that time. And of course, we know that there were Jews connected to Bevis Synagogue that were living in the colonies, as it were, in different Spanish and Portuguese communities in the 13 colonies, in places like Newport and New York, and Philadelphia, and Charleston, Savannah. And as a result, there's lots of wonderful connections between the history of Bevis Marks and the history of America, because of course Sephardic Jews participated in the events of the American Revolution. And there's lots to talk about with it, but I'm going to just do a series of talks that will focus on different aspects of it. What I want to talk about in this topic is perhaps an ode to the Spanish and Portuguese Jews of America in respect to the fact that they have sometimes preserved traditions that have been lost in the Spanish and Portuguese in London. And so normally think of, those little colonial synagogues, those little colonial congregations. But sometimes what you have is when you have a smaller community, as New York was. New York was maybe just a few hundred Jews by the beginning of the 19th century. I mean, it will have massive population growth throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century. But back then, you're talking about a few hundred Jewish people that are there. But sometimes when you're a small community, you maybe latch on really tightly to customs because you realize how precarious your position is. When you're a big community that has thousands of Spanish and Portuguese Jews, like in London, maybe you take a different approach to how things are retained. And of course, at Bevis Marks, much has been retained, but we know that some things also have changed. Shh, don't tell anyone, particularly during the Victorian era. There were some changes. The most famous of the changes that will take place is the thing that we maybe most associate with the Spanish and Portuguese Jews, which is choral singing. The introduction of a choir will take place in the 19th century. In the 18th century, you don't have choirs. That is very kind of 19th century in style. Not that you don't have any choral music anywhere or whatever, but it's something that grows in popularity in the 19th century. And it will begin to be introduced into Bevis Marks in the early 1800s, first by Chacham Raphael Meldela. It could be he's already seen it coming from Italy, right? And of course, it's something which is becoming increasingly popular in English culture. And at first, it will happen with some young boys will sing along with him. And eventually, by 1840, they kind of formalize the choir, and they add choir stalls into Bevis Marks, right? It's one of the few physical changes to the building over the centuries, right? And from that point forward, there will be kind of a formal choir in the Spanish and Portuguese, even choir books, yeah? Well, I don't know in terms of the books, but choral singing and having a choir master, having choir stalls, and so on, right? So something that's so much part of the community is something that actually was an innovation in terms of the musical style. Now, at the same time, what you find is that certain elements were dropped. You had a choir. I'm assuming this is the rationale. You also you make the service longer. So something's got to budge. So in this book written by Albert Heimsen, this is I think from 1954. He wrote this, or 1956. He wrote this for the 300th anniversary of the resettlement. He writes about the Sephardim of England, and he has an appendix at the end, which is quite juicy, where he talks about all the things that have changed in the ritual over the centuries. I'm not sure that I agree with all of his assessments, but he does have one line here which I know to be true, because he says the following. He says it was for probably the same reason of wanting to kind of make things move a bit more quickly, that in April 1829, the singing of Hodu on Sabbath morning was discontinued. Now, if you attend Bevis Marks, you won't know what I'm talking about because we don't sing Hodu. But if you go to Shearith, Israel in New York, Hodu is sung. Hodu is at the very end of Korbanot, the sacrifices. When you begin Zemirot, right, the opening part is Hodu, and they sing it, and they sing it together, and it's a wonderful melody. Hodu l'Adonai kiru bishmo, hodiu ba'amim alilotav, shiru lo, zamiru lo. And it continues like that. It's a melody that we have in London that we sometimes use in the Hallel. Yeah, we sometimes use it in Hallel, but it's not something that we sing for the Hodu. But in New York, they still do it. And another indication that it had been done here in London is that in Chazan David Aaron de Sola's book of music that he published in 1857, which is the first recording of the liturgy of the community in musical notation, he actually has this melody in there for Hodu. So even though they were no longer doing it, perhaps as Chazan, he said, I'm still going to record it as having been done before it's completely forgotten. And so here you have this wonderful thing that our wayward, rebellious cousins, as it were, in America, despite having left, have also preserved an element which was part of the original custom, part of the original minhag here in London too. And it's one of the reasons that it's so interesting to kind of think about our communities, not just kind of individually, but kind of being familiar with the different Spanish and Portuguese communities collectively, that when you do that, you can kind of have a compare and contrast, and you can kind of pick up on things and say, why is this different? What's going on over here? What's the story? In this story, it's that in New York, they've preserved an early tradition of singing the Hodu, but in London, in 1829, they decided to discontinue it, perhaps because they were starting to introduce the choral music, which incidentally they also have in New York, but perhaps felt that that was starting to make the service a bit too long, and they found ways of not changing, of course, the liturgy, the rite, but maybe playing a bit with the melodies in order to ensure that the service would move along a bit smoothly. So just one of the nice connections between our communities, but in upcoming videos I'll talk about some of the impact that Bevis Marks had on the American congregations as well. Thank you.